There are two things I want to talk to you about. One of them is student-centered learning, and the other is the learning environment. Before I talk about those things, I want to make sure that you understand that I will talk about these things in the sense of what is the goal of education. So let's start by defining the goal of education. The goal of education is to prepare people for an unseen world from which we cannot actually predict how it will work. We do not know how the society will work in the year 2025, but we do want people to be able to cope, manage, live in that society, to function as human beings. The most pressing question in education usually is what happens in the classroom. If the correct things happen in the classroom, then everything is correct, everything is perfect. Now, what happens in the classroom in formal education today? Well, most of the times you have a book and you have a teacher. Now, this teacher does several things. This teacher chooses the book. It chooses the chapters we read from that book. The teacher chooses which subject we spend how much time upon. In what order do we deal with the subjects? And in what ways or methods do we deal with these subjects? So the teacher is making a lot of choices and not really leaving any of the choices to the students. The students really do not get asked what are their preferences, what are their goals within this topic, what is their motivation to even learn this topic, what are their presumed or mostly liked ways of learning this topic. So the interests, motives, previous knowledge about this topic is often disregarded. And that leaves us at a very bad position. Now, that shouldn't necessarily be like that. We say that is very different if you look into non-formal education. Because non-formal education, as you know, is voluntary. Now, being it voluntary means that if you do end up doing non-formal education, you have done several things. First, you have thought about what do I want to do? Secondly, where do I want to do it? Thirdly, with whom do I want to do it with? Fourthly, in which way or manner do I want to do it? Fifthly, what will I gain out of this? Sixthly, what ways will it benefit me in real life, etc., etc. The list goes on. And that actually means that the student has given a lot of thought of why the student is there, what the student is doing, etc., etc. The student has become an active agent in the process of learning as opposed to being a passive agent in the process of being taught, which we often see in formal education. We see in formal education that all of these thought processes have been taken away from the student and have already been sort of pre-thought for the student in things like the national curriculum, in semester plans, in weekly schedules, in monthly term plans, etc., etc. The student is expected to just show up and do as they're told. Now, this links me back to my original question. How do we make people cope in the year 2025? Do we want people who are able to do what they're told and follow rules? Or do we want people who are able to actually guide their own paths, carve their own ways to creativity, happiness, etc., etc.? I think the answer to that is very clear. And I think that formal education in this case has a lot to learn from non-formal education. Now, the second thing I want to talk to you about is the learning environment. This is something we like to call everybody are sitting behind benches, they are quiet and they are writing. That means they are learning. Now, that is a very weird concept, but also it is somewhat a true concept. If we turn back clocks for about 100 years' time and go back to the beginning of the 20th century, then that actually is true. That was a very good method of teaching people at the beginning of the 20th century. You would show up, sit behind the desk and do as you're told. Because probably later on in life, you would work in a factory where you would show up, sit behind the desk and do as you are told. So in that sense, school was a brilliant simulation of real life. Now, the problem with that is that real life has moved on, but school really hasn't. If we look at schoolhouses, they're still being built with the same 100-year-old concepts in mind. If we look at the design and the layout of classrooms, then you can still see that the furniture, etc., in there is in principles that are being laid upon for already 100 years ago. Yes, occasionally or even often, the blackboard and white chalk has been replaced with a computer and a projector, but often that does not much more than replace white text on the classroom with a black text on the classroom, and I'm not sure if that color differentiation actually makes us better at teaching or learning. Very seldom we see that you actually have things like the biology teacher taking her children to the zoo, the maths teacher having a maths class in the computer lab, or Mr. President or a speaker of the parliament coming and talking about democracy in a classroom as a guest lecturer. These are all things that we regard as events, and we look upon those teachers and say, wow, isn't that great? Now, these events are great, but the problem is that we consider them still events. They shouldn't be. They should be the mundane, everyday happening of life, just as they are in non-formal education. In non-formal education, you constantly, day in, day out, you have role plays, you have simulations, you have experts that will talk about the field, that will give you an idea of how that field actually works really in the reality, in real world. And that gives you a much more tangible sense of actually doing the things instead of reading about the things and knowing how things are in real life. Again, let's link this back to my original question. Which sort of people do we need to function in the year 2025? Do we want people who have read about how stuff works, or do we want people who know how things work because they have tried it themselves, they have tasted, felt, and they know how things work? In conclusion, what am I trying to say? Am I trying to say that the train has left and there's now nothing for us to do? No, absolutely not. The train is still in the station. It is now up to you and up to us to choose the correct door that we enter from, because that door can have a huge significance. True, formal education gives you a lot, but there are things that formal education today can't give you and that non-formal education can give you. Non-formal education can open many doors that you couldn't even believe in. Non-formal education gives you an advantage in the workplace environment. And mainly, most importantly, if you talk to people who have been active in the non-formal education scene, then what you will see is that these people will very often say that becoming a part of non-formal education actually has changed the way they think, has changed the way they perceive the world, and has changed their life. And that is very significant.